Hopefully we'll kick out some old information that's really not useful anymore. So that's where we're going. I always show this slide. It's my medical disclaimer. Again, I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to, you can't come up to me after the seminar and ask, I can't grant you permission to stop your medication, kind of a thing. That's all what that says. So, learning objectives, I just put some basic things down here. We're going to learn about the metabolism and physiology of lipids and carbohydrates and how that relates to health conditions. Understanding the role of insulin in the body. I know when I went through pharmacy school, today I've got a whole different concept of what insulin's really doing in the body. There's the traditional way of thinking of insulin, and taking a type 2 diabetic and giving them more insulin, I just think is absolutely the worst thing in the world. So hopefully you'll have that same opinion by the time you leave tonight. Discussing endocrine disorders resulting from mismanagement of lipids and carbs. So there's some key things out there that I think are contributing to all the obesity and weight gain in our country. So we'll look at some of those things. So sometimes we are eating carbs and proteins and all these macronutrients. We think we're eating organic and healthy, and why do I keep gaining weight, kind of thing. So there are some things that we have to possibly clean up just in our endocrine system. We'll look at that. Compare and contrast healthy and possibly dangerous weight loss strategies. So we'll talk a little bit about ketogenic diets and paleo diets and so forth. We're not going to get too much into that tonight. Usually with dieting, again, I talked about this last month. Dieting is a 4-letter word that we probably shouldn't use. But we want to create just healthy eating habits. So we'll touch a little bit on that. And then one of my big favorite things is just supplements too. So I don't eat a perfect diet. I cheat probably just as much as everyone else here. So I live in the same world, right? So I like to use supplements to, stack the cards in my favor. So I'll look at some of those things tonight too. So I got a family of 6 kids. We're not out eating organic. I can't afford that. It's just, so what are some things that we can do though that might help us live a little bit healthier lives? So that's where we're heading for the next 45 minutes or so. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the numbers, but it is kind of horrific to see that diabetes is going up, obesity is going up, and so forth. Fat consumption is going down, though. So, we thought, we've demonized fat out there, and so we got to eat these low-fat diets and so forth because that's causing cardiovascular disease. Well, that's really not the case anymore. So, hopefully tonight too, we can take home that saturated fats aren't leading to cardiovascular disease. Well, if that's not the case and they're not increasing cholesterol, then what is the culprit there? Again, type 2 diabetes, 1 in 100 in 1960 were diagnosed with type 2. Now that number is 1 to 10, which is just staggering. So about 30 million people in the U.S. have type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance basically. And of that 30 million, about 30% of those patients, so about 10 million patients, don't even know that they don't even have a diagnosis yet. So that's pretty scary. 1 in 7 Americans were, I thought that was kind of a big number, in 1960 were considered obese, and now that's 1 in 3. Even 4 years ago, I'm sure that number is increasing. This is a really scary thing. When I went to pharmacy school, type 2 diabetes was just for adult onset, that was it. And now we're seeing type 2 diabetes in children, which I just think is horrific. So that's very, very scary. The last few parts of this presentation, I've actually did a little study, if you will, with my 10-year-old and quizzing her on the knowledge of fats and sugars and things like that. So that'd be kind of fun to go through. So help, yeah, what do I need to do to stay healthy, lose weight, reverse chronic disease? So again, we're going to focus on the macronutrient side of things. Of what can I do just diet-wise to basically live a better life? One really important thing that I like to drive home is a calorie isn't a calorie. So I'll probably edit this out of the video, but I'm not a fan of Weight Watchers because everything's just assigned a point value, and there's no value applied to that organic or more nutrient-rich food, and that just drives me absolutely crazy. So foods that go through our body have a profound different effect on our hormones, brain chemistry, and metabolism. I think intuitively we all know that. Fat calories burn differently than sugar calories. So when we go through our engine, when we go through the Krebs cycle, we get different amounts of energy expenditure or output, I should say, from a glucose molecule than we do from fat. So there's all kinds of different things going on there chemically. Here's maybe something that we don't know, but fats don't cause fat storage hormone insulin to spike in our blood. So what do I mean by that? So when we eat a high-fat diet, or a high-fat meal for that matter, we're not getting a spike of this hormone called insulin. Well, what happens when we eat a high-carb diet, even if it's a complex, whole grain, organic, just everything, we're thinking this is the best meal for us, but it's heavy on carbs, is that you are getting an over-release of insulin. Insulin's main job in the body is, in my opinion, is to store fuel. It does other things too we'll talk about in a few minutes, but that's something to understand, is that fats aren't causing that excessive insulin release into our blood. And the important thing there is it's not spiking it. If you get a spike over a certain threshold, we all have a different threshold, but if that insulin level gets above a certain point, it's kind of like game over. All of those carbohydrates, as organic and healthy as they might have been, are going to be stored and converted into fat. So that's scary. I mentioned this already, so I apologize, I get ahead of my slides here, but the consumption quality of food that determines weight gain or loss, and the hormones that are released. So there's a whole endocrine orchestra going on behind the scenes with every meal that we eat. We got to keep that in mind too. These macronutrients are messengers of information that are releasing all types of different hormones in our body. So that's something we'll get more into. And again, this slide isn't anything new that I haven't discussed already. I call it the industrial American diet. Some people call it the SAD diet, standard American diet. Our calories are going up. In the 50s, they were about 1,900 calories per day, and now they're over 2,600. And that information was even 10 years ago. I don't even know what it is current. I couldn't find any current numbers, but I'm sure it's even more than that now, considering that obesity rates are going up, they're not going down. And then the issue with refined flours, sugars, and vegetables. So we're, everything's go, 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 run, run, run. We want everything convenient, but it's at a cost. So that's a huge problem. I found this interesting too. Talked about this last month about, when we stripped all of the nutrients out of flour, the germ, the bran, what ended up happening is that was great for processing and storing food and keeping it on the shelf longer, and we thought it was a healthier option because it didn't spoil, but it ended up being just horrendous for our health. So kind of did this to ourselves. We all know this, soda consumption has gone way up. The numbers are just staggering. Somebody's buying these big gulps at 7-Eleven, right? They're not, they don't have those cups there just for show. 32 ounce, 64 ounce, some places they're 128 ounces. Who's drinking this stuff? It's absolutely crazy. And it's cheap calories, right? $2 for, 1,000 calorie drink. Oh, very scary stuff there. And then it's not so much to even, I talked about this last month, of you can take, this is a mouse study, but what they did is they took a group of mice and they fed them, basically I call it the McDonald's diet, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And they took another group of those mice, but they restricted their feeding time, and their rates of obesity went down, their rates of cardiovascular disease went down. So even if you eat a poor diet, sometimes it's just what time of day you're eating it or who you're eating it with has an influence on our health. So the disappearance of the family meal can be a contributor to some of these things too. So we got to keep that in mind. And then my favorite, I was going to try to, I had ran out of time, I was going to raffle away a toaster oven tonight. And then, but the trick would be, or the hope would be that you throw away your microwave, because I just hate those things. So like even in our break room, when I started here, we just had a microwave. I brought in the toaster oven. I'm like, this thing is just horrendous. So we just got to be understanding of how we're even preparing our food. Even if it might be a poor nutrient meal, that we're at least cooking it the best way that we can is important. So, and then in today's day and age, we're too stressed to even sleep now. So cortisol is rising through the roof. and we seem to be wired and tired, and as I'm drinking my coffee to keep myself going right now. So again, I'm not immune to any of this stuff, but we want to have that awareness of what's going on. Another important thing, as I was sitting through this seminar in Pewaukee, and again, this was a 6-hour class that I went through, I felt there was bias to this, and that this was kind of just the traditional, standard information that I would be fed in pharmacy school. I hate to say it that way. I mean, I love the education I got, but I mean, I think everything comes with a bias of what's the agenda behind some of these things. We have to really look at the literature that's out there that's dictating how we should live our lives and what we should eat and those kind of things. So what I've got written here, studies over the past 20 years seem to alternate between beneficial effects and harmful effects. 1 year drinking coffee is good for you, and the other year it's not. Does it reduce colon cancer? Does it not? It's great. Eating eggs. Oh my! I mean, are they good? Are they bad? Are they coming from China? What's going on? Are they real eggs? Consuming soy, is that a good thing? Is that not? I put in here, and this is not obviously related to food, but using hormone replacement therapy. That's 80% of our business here at our lab. Every year there's this conflicting data. What are we supposed to believe? So it gets kind of messy. So what do we need to ask? What type of study is it? Is it based on a mouse model or a rat or some other type of animal, or is it human study? Is it just a petri dish? There was a study that they referenced in this class that I went to about looking at, they took saturated fatty acids and put them in a petri dish, and it caused inflammatory cells to come out of cell culture. So does that mean that fatty acid that was in that petri dish is now bad for our body? Maybe, but let's give it a full clinical trial, do some blinded study, do a crossover study. Those kind of things I think we got to evaluate this scientific or this medical research a little bit more by instead of just taking turning on the news in the morning and seeing what they're saying. And then the other thing too, that my favorite, who funded the study? With with the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, that's just I sat through so many presentations of drug reps, trying to pitch the new ACE inhibitor or the new blood pressure medication and so forth, and you're always looking at things like number to treat to gain another positive outcome versus side effects versus cost and those types of things. So we really have to realize, what's the agenda behind the person or the corporation or whoever is funding that study. And then other things like, the results based on large population. A lot of these studies are done and, they're taking healthy individuals without any medication and then extrapolating that data to everyone under the sun. So we got to look at that too. And then what type of medical research actually is it? Is it observational or is it experimental? There's a lot of studies. I just picked this one out here. This was New England Journal of Medicine, which is highly respected medical journal. But this is just an observational study. It talks about inflammation, atherosclerosis, and coronary artery disease. So does inflammation cause coronary artery disease, or is it high cholesterol? Or is it a combination of both? So those are just things we need to start looking at going, was this in the real world, or is this just looking at medical records and so forth? So we got to be aware of those things. And then again, being able to accept evidence-based medicine without bias. So, we might have a preconceived conception of this is the way it should be. So this study, doesn't meet my criteria. So, Albert Einstein. Yeah, if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research, would it? So we're just still trying to figure this stuff out. I'm not claiming to have all the answers tonight, but I want to at least give you some information that's, a different way to look at some things. So. So we're going to get into dietary fats for maybe the next 10 minutes here. So real basic understanding. The way I think of fats in general now is it's energy, but it's also information, and it's turning on our endocrine system. It's releasing a whole list of different hormones downstream. So it's not just fuel per se. So there's saturated fats, unsaturated, and trans fats. So what does that even mean, and why have saturated fats been demonized? I mean, this doesn't look scary to me per se. I mean, it's just a bunch of carbon molecules with hydrogen attached to it. Pretty standard stuff, which is basically what sugar is made out of too, for that matter. So why did those guys get a bad rap, versus the monounsaturated or polyunsaturated fats seem to be better for us, which I would argue actually oxidize more, which if there's oxidation of fats, it actually makes those fats even more harmful to us. So that's a topic we'll get into in a few minutes too. Versus polyunsaturated fats, so like your omega-3s, your omega-6s. Basically, these guys have double bonds or less hydrogens between the carbons, so who even cares about that? But basically that fat, that piece of fuel has a different shape. So that's different information. That's a different lock and key mechanism that's potentially going on. And again, signaling different hormones to either be turned on or turned off. So we got to, I think, kind of step back and take a bigger, a larger view of fatty acids and macronutrients in general, and say, okay, what's really going on here? So you can differentiate these fats by, again, the double bonds, the type of energy that's stored in these fats, but then also by sizes. So you look at some studies, and I'll pick on saturated fats. It seems like odd chain fatty acids that are saturated are more beneficial for our body. But then saturated fats that are even numbered carbons don't seem to be as beneficial. So you actually have to look at each. You can't just sometimes categorize all saturated fats have a negative impact on the body. So that's something that we have to really scrutinize. The other thing too, though, is that I'll pick on coconut oil. That's been demonized too, that it's a saturated fat, it's going to raise your cholesterol, which it's not, by the way. But coconut oil is 70% saturated fat, but there's some monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats in there too. So it's not just one single type of fat in one particular product, or even butter for that matter, or having beef or dairy. So the body recognizes each one of these fats differently, both by shape and size. So that's something to understand. This is just a depiction of saturated versus unsaturated. The key point that I want to take home on these unsaturated fats is anytime there's a double bond, or basically two carbons that are connected by more than one bond, essentially, just think of that as being able to be susceptible to oxidation. So if you think of rust on a car or steel, that kind of thing, the more double bonds you have, the more oxidation, the more rust can occur on that particular fat. So on unsaturated fatty acids, the general rule, like with the fish oil that we have, omega-3s are unsaturated. Keep them cold, keep them refrigerated, otherwise they're going to go rancid. So if you have your fish oil at home and it's not refrigerated, when you get home tonight, throw it in the fridge. Or you probably want to throw it out and just get a whole new bottle, depending on how bad it smells. You never want to leave a dead fish on your counter, nor why would you want to do that with the oil. Now granted, it's encapsulated, if it's not opened, hopefully they've packaged that and they've removed some of the oxygen and air out of there. But you want to make sure that you're keeping that omega-3 fatty acid, or even omega-6, omega-9 fatty acid in a cool temperature. So that's important to take away from that slide. Saturated fats are very stable. You don't have to worry so much about that. I just gave some general information. So highly saturated oils, I talked about coconut oil already. It's saturated, again, not 100% saturated, but mostly. Palm oil, palm kernel oils. And then saturated fats, meats, poultry, dairy. Again, these have overall been viewed as having a negative impact on the body. But hopefully tonight you'll see that a little bit differently. I'll get into that. So one big thing, saturated fats reduce inflammation. I will put a caveat on that though. They reduce inflammation in the absence of excessive carbohydrates. So if you, again, I'm just going to make up a study here, but if you take 100 patients and half of them, or they all eat saturated, let's do it this way. Well, all 100 patients eat saturated fats, but half of the group also eats carbohydrates to an excessive amount, those saturated fats now become inflammatory. So they increase inflammation. So you got to be careful in how you're looking at some of these things. So some of these studies that were referenced in the seminar that I went to, you start looking at the details and you go, well, yeah, saturated fats cause inflammation in this population because they were just eating their standard diet. So we really got to start looking at those things. Saturated fats increase inflammation. Again, I just said that, only in the presence of sugars and refined carbs. The other interesting thing too, though, is when you have a patient that doesn't have any omega-3 fatty acids in their body, then those saturated fats become inflammatory. So take-home point tonight is load up on your fish oils. I have it on my next slide, but you probably want to take at least 2 to 4 grams of fish oil every single day and keep it refrigerated. Don't let it go rancid. So saturated fats do not contribute to the elevation of cholesterol levels, but rather sugars and refined carbs. So we'll get to that in just a minute too. So how is that possible? My doctor told me that was the opposite. Real quick on trans fat, most of the medical world out there does agree on this about trans fats. Just stay away from them. The unfortunate part is with food labeling, you can reduce the serving size on your packaging so that the trans fats, and I don't remember what the cutoff is, I think it's 0.5 grams per serving or less, and then you can say that your food is trans fat free. So anything that's preserved, or I always say if you have to open it up and open up some type of packaging to get to that food, that's probably preserved with trans fats to some level, or you see hydrogenated anything, hydrogenated oils, that's a trans fat. You don't want to put that in your body. And I'm going to probably cut this out of the YouTube video too, but like Girl Scout cookies is a classic example of that. But I still love them. But it raises LDL cholesterol and inflammation, lowers HDL, so lowers the good cholesterol, so it's lowering the good, raising the bad. Again, I talked about this, found in processed foods and should be avoided at all cost. There was one study that actually contributes to memory loss. Now the interesting thing here, when I went through that seminar and was shown this slide about trans fats, that slide just said that that all trans fats contribute to memory loss in all patients. I pulled the study and looked at it, and it was only men under 45 years of age. There wasn't a clinical significance in men over 45 or any women at all. Which is, now I'm not advocating that if you're over 45 and you're a male, but it's, you know, it's interesting that there's differences here. And so you got to really start looking at the nitty-gritty of some of this information. So I found that to be, you know, I was led to believe that trans fats were any population of patients, they'd have a negative impact on. And that was strictly just memory loss. It still affected their cholesterol in a negative way. Omega-9s, I'm kind of going backwards here. I'm going to go omega-9, 6s, and then 3s. I don't know why it came out that way, but monounsaturated fats, main sources, olive oil. That's a good oil to consume. Avocado oil. Canola oil, though, again, you got to look at each one of these fats. Canola oil is horrendous. I'm not going to get it all into that. If you want to know the whole story behind canola oil, I don't have this in the slides, but Dr. Mark Hyman wrote a fantastic book called Eat Fat, Get Thin. And he gives you the whole story behind canola oil, but basically the gist of that is stay away from canola oil. And then these are considered as essential fatty acids, so basically our body can't produce them from something else, so it is something that we do need to consume. I'm sorry, the other way around. I said that backwards. Not classified as essential, so we can make those. Again, can be produced from unsaturated fats. Again, generally have an anti-inflammatory activity, but not always. So we do have to look at that particular omega-9 and see where that's coming from. 6s and 3s are polyunsaturated, so again, we're having double bonds in different areas of that carbon chain, which again has opportunity for oxidation. Always got to keep that in mind. Safflower oils are mainly 6s. Sesame oil is a combination of omega-6s and 9s. Fish oils are mainly 3s. Again, I'm a huge fan of omega-3 fatty acids. The more and more I learn just about omega-3s, and specifically DHA and EPA, really as long as we're not eating a refined or sugar-heavy diet, omega-3s, even though then they've got those double bonds, they're overall very cardioprotective. So fatty fish, fish oils, again 2 to 4 grams a day is what I always keep in my mind. Walnuts are especially protective against cardiovascular disease, very anti-inflammatory. Achieving optimal health by consuming a diet with a ratio of omega-6s to 3s is important. So there's this whole debate of, how many omega-3 fatty acids do I need to consume in a day versus omega-6s. Breast milk has a ratio of about 11 to 1. Compared again with the standard American diet, we eat way too many omega-6 fatty acids. And so we want to try to, what's the goal? There's, should it be more to that breast milk ratio of 11 to 1? More of the studies are favoring more, even lower than that, a 4 to 1. So that means I need to be consuming, for every 4 grams of omega-6s, I need to be consuming 1 gram of fish oil, basically. That's a lot of fish oil. So, all right, moving on to carbohydrates. So, not that I'm going to quiz you on these chemical structures at all, but just I wanted to kind of give you that visual. Again, we're just talking about carbons and oxygens here and alcohol groups, so just energy bonds essentially. You got glucose, galactose, fructose, different types of simple sugars. Here's the same depiction of that. Glucose comes in basically a ring, if you will. So these are monosaccharides, or just one sugar molecule. This is sucrose, so you've got 2 sugar molecules attached to each other. And then you got your complex carbohydrates. You got your starches. That's what this is here, just a bunch of glucose molecules essentially strung together. But then it takes enzymes to break those up. So that's basically a complex carbohydrates. It takes more to metabolize that. Who cares about any of that chemistry? But what ends up happening is if you go for more of the glucose or sucrose, it's sweeter to the tongue, of course, we all know that. And then it raises your blood sugar a heck of a lot faster, because then it gets quickly absorbed right through your GI tract into your bloodstream. Compared to the starches and whole grains, they got to be broken down. Enzymes have to come in there, and that's a whole process involved. Then you got fiber in that mix too that slows down the absorption of those sugars. So again, whole grains, complex carbohydrates, they're a better sugar, but they're still sugar. So that's something to, again, take away too. So again, just another, just so you have the idea here of what's going on. Because in a few more minutes, I'll show you a slide where we're actually taking sugar and converting it into fat. I mean, the body can very easily take this structure here and turn it into a saturated fat, and do that in the liver. And it does that every day, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. That's what's happening. This gets a little technical here, but hopefully we can weed through this together. So I already showed you those structures. So you've got glucose, fructose, which is the sweetest of simple sugars, and galactose. When you stick a fructose and a glucose molecule together, you've got a disaccharide called sucrose. Again, that takes a little bit more energy to break down. That's my point there. You got lactose sugar. You find that in milk and maltose. You got 2 galactose sugars combined. When you're building complex carbohydrates, you're still taking those simple carbohydrates and just stringing them together now in a further line. That's really all you're doing. We call that starch, or a complex carbohydrate. Those are combined with alpha bonds. Not that that name's important, but those we can break down, and then you're going to slowly get all those sugar molecules into your bloodstream. If you're not burning up that complex carbohydrate, if it's that organic, wonderful whole grain bread that you're paying 10 times much more than just the standard Wonder Bread. Complex carbohydrate is a complex carbohydrate is a complex carbohydrate. It's still going to give you, again, you're getting other micronutrients. I'll give you that and that kind of thing, and probably less preservatives and hopefully pesticides, herbicides, all that other junk, and hopefully Roundup's not sprayed on it. But you're still on a macronutrient level. You're still getting sugars. Unlike with fibers, we all know this, they're indigestible. Our body can't break down beta bonds. However, again, we have soluble, insoluble fibers, but what we do have is bacteria in our GI tract that can break that down for us. So eventually those will get broken down. And that's a slower process. So you're not going to get that insulin spike. So the slower sugars enter into our bloodstream, the less of that hormone insulin is going to be dumped into our bloodstream. we're trying to minimize the amount of insulin that our body has to dump out. The way I sometimes think of insulin, it's a fat storage hormone, and I'm trying to minimize the amount of insulin or fat storage hormone that I have to use to get that energy into my body. Because the more I have to dump insulin into my body to take care of those carbohydrates, the more inflammation that's going to be created in my body, and the more carbohydrates are going to be turned into fat. My favorite sugar here is high fructose corn syrup, which is just absolutely horrendous. So you take cornstarch, that picture I just showed you with the alpha bonds, which is we can break those down without any gut bacteria, and just apply some heat to it. And now you've broken all those bonds, but you've also taken the galactose sugar, and you converted those into the fructose. And the problem with that is we get so addicted to fructose. Lights off our dopamine center, our pleasure center in our brain, and we just crave that stuff. So what happens with fructose, taken to the liver for conversion, it's turned into saturated fat. Uh-oh, that's not good. I'll get to that in a minute. It's turned into triglycerides. That's not good either. And in turn raises LDL cholesterol. So I'd rather you eat cornstarch than I would rather have you have neither of those, but definitely stay away from high fructose corn syrup. So yeah, you're taking fructose. So when you're consuming high fructose corn syrup, which is in just about everything, like ketchup has high fructose corn syrup. If you're not basically burning it up as energy, that fructose is going into your liver, and there's enzymes that are going to take that molecule and turn it into a saturated fat. So that's not a good thing. I'd rather you just eat the saturated fat right off the bat. And the reason is, well, why would you want to do that? Well, in this process here, your body's releasing a bunch of insulin trying to take care of this guy right here. Because that insulin is actually taking that fructose sugar now, take it over to the liver and drop it off there, and now the liver's got to churn it up and crank it into that. So that whole process takes energy, it takes hormones, your whole endocrine system's all getting out of control because of that. But you feel good because, oh man, that was so sweet on the tongue, and oh my God, that tasted so well. And so your dopamine centers just lighten up. So I put on here, 1 medium-sized apple contains approximately 13 grams of fructose. So if you're not exercising, if you're not burning up that energy, what's 13 times 4, whatever that number is, 60 calories. How many calories are we burning in a day? How many steps? We can figure all that out with Fitbits now and all that stuff. But if you're not burning up all of that complex carbohydrate, that's getting converted into saturated fat in your liver. And then it's getting transported with LDL all over your body and stored.
So does that mean we should not be eating apples?
Not excessively. Yeah. But I'm not sure, to be honest with you. But you could look up, which fruit that is. And I'm not saying not to eat any fruit, but we just got to be aware of this, that we're not. I'll tell you a story of, using the Jack LaLanne, I don't know what mixer, juicer, thank you, where I take all the fiber out of the fruit. And I thought, oh, this is so healthy for me. I'm actually getting all my fruits and vegetables in. Yeah, nuts. I didn't even measure my blood glucose back then, but I can't imagine what it was, just through the roof. That's kind of scary to think about that. So, glycemic index. So, not that this is terribly important, but I think, again, a Mountain Dew is going to raise your blood sugar, and it's going to cause more insulin release. It's going to cause more fat storage compared to whole grain bread. So that's basically glycemic index, is how quickly are those sugars, be it simple complex carbohydrate, simple sugars, disaccharides, polysaccharides. That's, how quickly are those sugars going to be broken down and entered into our bloodstream. Pure glucose has a value of 100, and everything's kind of stratified from that. High glycemic index foods, you could probably guess what those are, but again, my wonderful high fructose corn syrup, white bread. There's actually, depending on what study you look at, but whole grain bread actually has a higher glycemic index than white bread. I don't know why exactly, but some people think it does. I think it depends on the patient. White rice, cornflakes, white potatoes. So anything starchy, your body's just going to break up those molecules. A lot of patients come in and ask, well, what's better, white potatoes or sweet potatoes? Well, again, if we're just looking at from a macronutrient point of view, it doesn't matter. They're both going to raise your blood sugar. You're going to release too much insulin at some point, and those carbohydrates from that sweet potato or that white potato are going to turn into fat. On the other hand, like low glycemic foods, beans, legumes, seeds, nuts, whole intact grains, most above ground vegetables. So that's kind of what we want to focus on, keeping that carbohydrate influx into our blood at a slow rate. This was one of the points on, I think, the flyer that we put out there, something called red meat sugar. I call this the 5G sugar. Basically, there's information out there that red meat contains this sugar that's been identified that can, again, these are mouse studies, not human studies, not double-blinded placebo crossover studies. So there's a lot of questions still to be answered about red meat sugar. But in the short term, this sugar that's found in red meat and pork and lamb for that matter can increase inflammation just after one meal. And then long-term studies, again, just in mice, are showing that I'm going to call it the 5G sugar. I think that's kind of clever of me. Thank you. Is creating tumor growth. So not a good thing, potentially leading into cancer. Is this transferable to humans? We don't know yet. One of my questions that I came up with right away was, well, beef, pork, and lamb, what were they eating? So depending on what the animal's eating is going to dictate what their saturated fats are, how they're composed, and so forth. So that's something too that we need to be, again, thinking of when we're getting this information. This slide just summarizes the insulin. I hit on most of this, but insulin processes, it does help with cognition. So we definitely need insulin. Before thought insulin was like the worst thing ever. We need it to survive. But it helps with cognition and mental function. It takes glucose to our brain and that kind of thing to help us think. But it helps with glucose homeostasis, protein metabolism, fat metabolism, growth, reproduction. So we certainly need insulin in our body. We can't live without it, but we don't want to get too much either. Pathways, it helps with the glucose uptake, amino acid uptake, glycogen synthesis, so that's where it's just taking simple carbohydrates and actually stringing them together in the liver. Insulin's responsible for that. Amino acid synthesis, so with tissue repair, growth and repair. Lipogenesis is basically what I showed you with that fructose molecule, actually taking sugar and making fat. That's, again, what insulin's doing. But then it also helps with protein synthesis too. So it's not all bad, but if we get too much of this hormone in our body, it can cause a lot of problems, a lot of inflammation. So we got to make sure we're measuring our insulin levels. So I'll talk about that a little bit down the road here too. Because if your doctor's not monitoring your insulin level, that's something you want to make sure next time you go see him or her that hey, test my insulin level. So obesity epidemic, this is just getting worse and worse every year in our country. Medical causes and behaviors. So just some numbers here. So obesity, defined as men having a waist circumference of over 40 inches, women is 35, and then a BMI, if you are over 30%, you're considered obese, and then over 40% is morbidly obese. Not that those numbers are terribly important, but we should know what our number is there. That's an easy measurement we can take. I'm going to get into, so some of these things here is, again, if we're eating the right fats, we're eating the right carbohydrates, but we're still gaining weight and still obese or whatever the case may be, these are just some of the more common issues that can go wrong with the endocrine system that we at least have to rule out and say, okay, do I have diabetes? Do I have insulin resistance, and how can I reverse that? Do I have hypothyroidism? Is my thermostat of my body set too low? That's going to, you can eat the healthiest diet and you're still going to gain weight. You might have low growth hormone, we'll talk about that, or excessive cortisol. That's a huge thing that's going on still. Even when I got out of pharmacy school, Dr. John Wilson wrote this book about adrenal fatigue and on how too much cortisol and excess belly fat and so forth, and it just self-perpetuates. It's horrendous. So we what is our cortisol level? Are we measuring that number? What is it at? What's an acceptable level or range that the cortisol should be at? Because, some stress in our life is important and gets us to move and, get us through our day, but we don't want to have too much of it either. So there's a fine balance there. This is basically how diabetes works in a nutshell. So you've got increased visceral fat, so I'm just talking like deep, sub-Q fat is what that essentially means. And then you've got decreased muscle mass as we age. So as our muscle mass diminishes, we're not able to basically burn up carbohydrates as efficiently as we'd like to. So then what ensues is you've got insulin resistance, meaning you need more of that hormone to get sugar into muscle tissue and into cells. And that whole process just creates inflammation. So the more insulin around in our body, essentially there's more inflammation. There's more processes going on, more free radical damage. That leads to increased body fat. And the other thing with insulin is, I didn't mention this yet, is it makes us hungry. So when we over-release insulin, you're going to get hungry and you're going to eat. So the current treatment strategy is to, let's add more insulin medications. So there was a whole, I've been so far removed from traditional pharmacy now, I was going to call one of my colleagues, but I forgot to do that today. But there's a whole class of medications called sulfonylureas. So like glyburide, glipizide, I can't even think of the other ones that are out there anymore. And their whole job, that whole drug class of medications, was to basically take those beta cells inside the pancreas and squeeze more insulin out of them. Oh yeah, and then so what happens then, right? You have more insulin coming out of that patient's pancreas, and so their blood sugars look great. Well, where's all that sugar going? To their liver, because what is insulin doing? Taking that sugar, dropping it off at the liver, and telling it to turn into fat. Looking back on that now, pharmacologically, that drug makes no sense. That whole class of drugs. Neither does insulin, for that matter. Now, granted, you might need that because if you get to a certain level, then that patient's going to have a coma, essentially. So you've got to move that sugar somewhere out of the blood. But the net effect is the more insulin either you're producing or giving that patient, the net effect is increased body fat. And then that just keeps going and going and going. And then again, you're hungry again. Hypothyroidism. So thyroid hormone regulates protein, fat, carbohydrate metabolism. So that's important to understand too. That hormone, we just spent so much thyroid medication here. I think actually it's, maybe I've said this already, but I think thyroid medication is way overused. That's a whole nother talk for another night. But underactive thyroid hormone, underactive thyroid leads to memory problems, weight gain, sensitivity to cold. There's, a whole list of, this isn't all inclusive, but there's a whole list of symptoms here. So the point is though, this thing here, weight gain, 15 pounds on average if you have low thyroid function. That's just a scary number. So we gotta be testing patients properly for low thyroid function, not just getting a TSH level, but getting your T3 and your T4 levels measured to actually finding out what's going on with that particular patient so we can treat them appropriately. Because I see so many patients that are on thyroid medication and they just can't even lose weight. So there's still something wrong with that patient. And we gotta know all the pieces of the puzzle of what's going on there. Low growth hormone, I don't see a lot of that here, but it is, it's underdiagnosed, as I said here, causes weight gain and fatigue. And it's something that we should, if we've ruled everything else out, you can test for growth hormone. It's a simple blood test that asks your doctor to do essentially, but we got to find out what's going on there. There's lifestyle modification here that we can do to increase growth hormone, getting better sleep, exercising, periodic fasting. If you haven't done intermittent fasting, I highly recommend doing that, where you're taking a span of 12 to 16 hours per day and not consuming any calories. I absolutely love that. Just losing weight in general is going to help increase growth hormone. And then I put on here, increasing protein intake if it's low for a patient. Obviously, you don't want to overproteinate yourself and burn out your kidneys either, so you got to be careful with that. And then quite the opposite, if you have low growth hormone in your body, it could be due to insomnia, you're not sleeping well, inactivity, excessive alcohol, just general aging, chronic stress. We'll get to that in the next slide here. But cortisol wreaks havoc on growth hormone. So, sometimes with these endocrine issues, they contribute to the next one and the next one and the next one. So what happens here with chronic stress and sugars, I put, digital overload or just life in general, lifestyle stress causes us to, eat comfort food, and we're eating carbohydrates mainly. Haagen-Dazs ice cream disappears, in the middle of the night. You get enlarged fat cells, and what happens is chronic stress of excess of cortisol and chronic inflammation ensues. So what goes on from there is then we eat more and more. When those fat cells expand, those insulin receptors spread apart, and now you need more insulin to open up these doors to get fuel inside the fat cells. So that's not a good thing. So then what happens here, I got both arrows pointing down here. Chronic elevation of cortisol leads to increased cravings for sweets and carbs. So if you are, and this might not even be perceived by the patient. You go and measure their cortisol and it's elevated. Then you start asking them questions. Oh yeah, I sip on Mountain Dew all day, or by 10 o'clock in the morning I'm reaching for my second bagel, kind of a thing. Or just constantly eating. Measure their cortisol, see where it's at. But are these questions that doctors are asking them? It's important to figure that out and to test for that. Supplements to consider. So how am I doing on time here? Pretty close, 7:20. I'm not recommending to take all of these except for the fish oil. But a high quality multivitamin, I prefer something called Mitocore. It's helps with, I didn't talk much about this yet tonight, but when our bodies are producing energy and ATP, there's these little energy cells called mitochondria that are just cranking out energy. But in that process, there's all kinds of metabolic debris going on and free radical damage, and Mitocore helps us suck a lot of that free radical damage up. So I'm a huge fan of Mitocore as my multivitamin. 2 grams of fish oil a day minimum. If we're trying to get to that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of balancing inflammation with anti-inflammatory effects, probably that's the bottom of the dosing range that I recommend is 2 grams a day. Vitamin D, just make sure your blood level is 50 to 80. Whatever that takes. A lot of patients come in and say, well, how much do I need to take? 1,000 units, 2,000 units, 5,000 units, 10,000, 50, whatever it takes to get to 50 to 80 is what I say. Each patient's going to be a little bit different on there. It's not always a linear scale. L-carnitine, if you have a lot of fatigue, 300 to 400 milligrams twice per day, helps transport fat cells to be burned up as fuel. So if you're doing a ketogenic diet for a short period of time, it's great to do L-carnitine as a supplement. So some of these things, you got to put these supplements in perspective of what are you eating, what macronutrients are you eating. Because if you just add L-carnitine to a standard American diet, you're wasting your money. I'll tell you right now. So magnesium, 200 to 400 milligrams a day. If you know me by now, you're always going to want to take reacted or chelated magnesium. It's 4 times better absorbed than the traditional magnesium that's out there. PGX fiber, Dr. Mark Hyman's a huge fan of PGX fiber. It's a super fiber, slows down blood sugar and insulin spikes. You're trying to avoid those insulin spikes. So if you're going to cheat and have something sweet, just do me the favor and follow it up with some fiber. If it's the PGX fiber, it's some basic fiber psyllium husk capsules that we have, something, then you're not going to get that huge spike of insulin. That's where you really get kind of the double whammy there. Cuts down on cravings, anywhere from 2 to 5 grams per day with a large meal. So that's a good trick. If you get cravings at night, like me, I'll eat like 3 dinners. I'll get home and eat dinner, and I'll put the kids to bed, and I'll eat another meal, it seems like. Like, what am I doing? Then I have PGX fiber. Oh yeah, I should probably take some of that fiber, right? Listen to my own words here. So again, you're going to get all this in the email tomorrow. Probiotics. We looked at those beta bonds that bacteria are needed to break that material down. So if you've been on a lot of antibiotics, if you have any kind of GI distress, gas, bloating, you feel really full after meals and so forth, it doesn't hurt to take a good probiotic. I would even say that number is a little bit low. I would probably up that to 50 billion CFUs a day, at least to get in, especially if you're symptomatic. I'd go a little bit higher on the dosing with that. MCT oil, I'm a huge fan of that. If you've heard my keto talks, it's basically medium chain triglyceride. That's what it stands for. It's a saturated fat, but it's very short chain. The shorter the chain, the quicker it can get burnt up as fuel. So in the presence of a low carb diet, so a keto diet, I love MCT oil because it's like it's rocket fuel. It doesn't even need to get metabolized. It'll go straight into our bloodstream and get burnt up as energy. So yeah, start low, go slow. Maybe a teaspoon 2-3 times a day. You can work up to a tablespoon 2-3 times a day. I'll put that in coffee at night if you need. I wish I knew this when I was in college, but if you put like a tablespoon of that in coffee, like at around 8-9 o'clock at night, you will be up for like 4 or 5 hours with just excellent brain energy. It's fantastic. But be careful with it. And then if you get too much, it causes diarrhea. So you gotta be careful on that. Electrolytes, a teaspoon of unrefined salt twice a day. So there are so many, again, this is one of those misinformation things out there that you get 100 patients with hypertension, only 2 of them have issues with sodium. So I'm not afraid of consuming salt as long as it's clean. And so just have that awareness. You need salt. Which leads me into iodine, which is our seminar for next month. I'm a huge fan of iodine. You need iodine. If you're going to be on a more ketogenic diet, you need to have plenty of iodine around. It gets rid of that metabolic waste. So that's we'll talk for a whole 2 hours on that next month. You do have to be very careful with iodine, though. Anyone with Hashimoto's cannot take too much iodine. It'll wreck up their thyroid real quick. So you got to be careful with that. Digestive enzymes, depends on the patient. 1 to 2 per meal, maybe more. I've had some patients have to go up to 3 or 4. But ideally, we're getting those enzymes from the food that we're intaking as well, too. We're not overcooking our food. We're not putting our food in a microwave, please, that kind of thing. But if you've got to eat a meal that's poor nutrient quality and so forth, it may not hurt to have some enzymes around to help break down that food. Yeah, only use if having digestive problems. Or I would say overcooking is bad, breaking down. It depends on the situation, but in general, yeah, you don't want to pulverize all the nutrients out of that food.
Overcooking's bad.
Overcook.
You said something about microwave. Don't microwave.
Don't microwave your food. It'll just.
It's a hot dog.
Well, all right, unless it's a hot dog. Yeah.
Coffee to warm it up. It's not going to hurt you.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't. I'd rather not. Yeah.
Explain more on microwave cooking.
What
it does to the food.
It just wrecks the quality of the food is the best way to describe it. You're radiating your food. Yeah. It's a slow death. So. Water, drink a lot of it. That's going to help if you're especially doing more healthier fats. You need water. It's the exhaust system of our body of just cleaning all this metabolic waste. So, and then make sure it's clean, though. Of course, don't be toxifying yourself while you're trying to detox. I don't know what the best equation is for the water, but just make sure you're getting enough of it throughout the day. Lab tests. Again, you're going to get this in the email tomorrow. Your C-reactive protein for sure. If you don't have that number, make sure you do. Goal of 0.3 or less. I put all this on there. Fasting blood glucose. Most labs say less than 100. If you've heard Dr. Whitcomb speak here, his number is less than 90, even 85, depending on some of like Dr. Dale Bredesen with the Alzheimer's and the end of Alzheimer's disease. You can even try to get that number down even lower. Fasting insulin. So again, a lot of doctors will, on your typical annual appointment with your physician, all they're going to do is test a fasting glucose. Well, that's great, but you can have, again, 100 patients and half of them, or let's just say all of them have the same fasting glucose number of 95. Well, if you're cranking out, 8 units of insulin to get to that number versus 16 units, well, I hope I'm the 8 unit guy and not the 16 because you're going to burn out your insulin having to crank out twice as many keys to keep your insulin under 100. And you can do that for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and all of a sudden then your blood glucose goes from 100 or 99, so you're just off the radar screen from your doctor, and then you're at 105 or 110. Well, your doctor could have caught that 5 years prior if he would have been measuring your insulin level that whole time, because he would have seen that insulin level go up and up and up every year. And then every patient's different. They'll get to a tipping point, and all of a sudden then that fasting blood glucose dumps over 100. So, got to know your fasting insulin level for sure. So when I did the keto diet, I can't remember what my number was. I think it was like 5 or 6. It wasn't terrible, but after doing keto for 18 months, I got it down to 3, which doesn't seem like, 6 isn't bad to begin with, but the less of that hormone you have, the less inflammation you have in your body. So, A1C 4.8 to 5.4 is a goal. Before keto, I was at 5.8, which is high. I got it down to 4.4 after doing the keto. Homocysteine levels 8, another marker of inflammation. Vitamin D, I talked about that already. LDL, so I'm not going to get terribly into LDL tonight, but there's different sizes of LDL. There's different subclasses of LDL. Not all LDL is bad cholesterol. There's light, fluffy particles of LDL. Those are the good ones. What you want to be measuring is the smaller particles of LDL, LPA, and that number wants to be less than 300. So just because you have a high LDL number doesn't mean it's bad. You want to find out what those subcategories are and look at LP(a). Even having said that, even taking it a step further, you actually want to look at LDL and what portion of that is actually oxidized. LDL in and of itself, all that bad cholesterol, is not bad. It only becomes bad when it actually gets oxidized. So you can actually measure that. Ask them for an oxidized LDL level. It should be below 60 or 60 or lower. So that's something too that you want to be aware of. And then you can test for your omega-3s. That's another nice number I like to look at now, is how much fish oil, what is your ratio of 6s to 3s. Goal for omega-3 index is 6 to 8. Maybe you're taking 2 grams of fish oil and thinking that's enough. Well, maybe you're somebody that needs double or triple that amount. So measure your omega-3 index, and you can see what that's at. All right, here's my slides. I got 5 more slides. I'll run through these quick. So I asked my 10-year-old daughter, my 5th grader, to give me 5 examples of healthy foods, unhealthy foods, and then 5 examples of sugars, and then 5 examples of fats. And that's all I told her last night. And this is what she came up with. So I thought this was kind of fun. 5 healthy foods. So she came up with blueberries, kale, salmon, eggs, and black beans. Not bad. And then her unhealthy foods, she said diet drinks, juices, energy drinks, fast foods, granulated sugar, interesting. Breakfast cereal, that's a huge one. I remember growing up eating, the Wheaties and putting table sugar on Wheaties or Cheerios. I don't even know how I'm still alive. Popcorn. That popcorn looks awfully sweet. The Garrett's popcorn on Navy Pier is absolutely delicious, but yeah. And then 5 foods that contain sugar. She put canned fruit, syrups. Like this stuff here, high fructose corn syrup, right, with some maple flavoring. That's the worst for you. Desserts, that's pretty general. Granola bars. I could eat like 6 of those in one sitting. Juice, again, fructose is getting turned. If you're not burning up that fructose sugar that's in those fruits, you're turning them into fat in your liver. Do that long enough, and that's fatty liver disease. And then foods that contain fat: cheese, avocado. I liked her list. It was interesting that when she Googled chocolate, it came up with CBD chocolate. How crazy is that? So I thought that was kind of interesting there. I thought that was a pretty good list for her, though. So I think that's it. Go.